up, friends? I'm James, your host, and today this is going to be the start of my new format. I talked about this in my little commentary on the comments page about how I wasn't really feeling the album review format anymore that I was doing. I kind of wanted to do things a bit more casual, kind of do things my own way, and to be honest, when I started this channel, it was really supposed to be more about like a casual discussion. I don't really claim to know a ton about, music and stuff like that, or how it, like the intricacies of how it's made, but, my channel was always supposed to be a sort of like intermediary step between someone who doesn't really listen to music all that much or all that critically, and the people who actually like know stuff about music. So, I feel like this is kind of going back to the root of what my channel was supposed to be when I started it and how I wanted it to be, and I just maybe didn't really know exactly how to do it. But anyway, what this format is going to be, the Music Lounge, it's basically going to be me talking about the albums that came out this year that I have listened to, some general thoughts on them instead of like a extremely detailed review on the albums. I'll, bring up a few songs that I like and dislike and what I feel about what the album's doing, And then at the very end, I'm going to be talking about just what I've been listening to this month in my day-to-day life. And this is going to be a sort of monthly series. I didn't really start at the beginning of the year like I wanted to, but I'm going to be starting now. I'm going to be trying to do this one, January and February, hopefully by like next week or so. And then for March, I'll do it by the end of the month so we can actually start doing it monthly in April. So with that, all that being said, let's get into the first album. So I guess a good place to start would be By Storm's My Ghost Go Ghost. This is the sort of first full-length project released by Storm. It's made up of the members of Injury Reserve after, the unfortunate passing of Groggs, and they were kind of just figuring things out for a while, and now they finally put out a full-length record with just Parker and Richie. Now, with this album, unfortunately, I do like it, but it has a lot of the same problems that I had with By the Time I Get to Phoenix by Injury Reserve. Every song just kind of meanders for like 4 minutes or so until it actually gets to the good part at the end. And, again, this is something that I really kind of struggled with By the Time I Get to Phoenix, where I feel like by the time the song gets interesting, it's over. I always thought that Injury Reserve record had the roots of a lot of great songs, and they just kind of needed to be expanded upon further. Well, this album does expand on the songs, but not in a very engaging way, I thought. It's fine enough. It does create a sort of moody atmosphere. I do get the emotions from Richie and Parker that are trying to be conveyed in this record, but I also don't think they're very engaging, or honestly even very interesting. A lot of the runtime of these songs feels a bit more like filler, and we, instead of actually like capitalizing on the more interesting moments that come in later down the line. Again, it's still a pretty decent record. Double Trio 2 was definitely one that I'm going to be coming back to. I think that's the best song on the album. That sort of bombastic feel to it. It has this almost like wall of sound effect to it with the sort of brass effects. I think that works really well. It kind of reminds me of maybe a sequel to like Three Man Weave off of the self-titled Injury Reserve album. But other than that, I can't really say all the other ones were super memorable to me. There's not really that many memorable hooks or, memorable instrumentals and beats, I find. And a lot of the time, I actually think that the vocals kind of get drowned out by the production. I don't know if it's like a mixing issue or whatever, but to me, it's not doing enough to really grab my attention. And, this is a more downcast album. It talks about Richie and Parker still trying to overcome the events that happened in the past and the passing of their friend. So I don't expect this album to be super hooky, but it's in a strange middle ground where some songs try to be a little bit more catchy, but I feel like they just never quite reach it. But it's also not enough of like a seamless experience to fully capitalize on like the sort of creating this atmosphere that I think they wanted to. Like if I were to compare it to something that how like creating an atmosphere, I would say maybe like the Avalanches, with Since I Left You, like that album has songs just weave into each other to the point where you almost can't even tell where one song ends and another song begins. And I feel like that would have been a more effective approach when it comes to this album in particular. In a way, this album actually also kind of reminds me of my gripes with the last St. Vincent record too, where it was experimental to the point where it actually kind of loops around to becoming unmemorable. You know, I can appreciate the sort of stream of consciousness angle that they're going for with this album, but in a lot of instances, it feels more like sort of lyrical and musical rambling a lot of the times. And, you know, that definitely does appeal to a lot of people. I've seen a lot of praise for this record as well, but for me personally, that doesn't really give me much to latch on to, unfortunately. It's kind of the reason why I can't get into a lot of like jam bands and a lot of other experimental artists with much looser song structures. I'm definitely someone who prefers a more structured song and album experience. And when it comes to experimental music as well, I tend to prefer the more like hard-hitting and like, I guess, more aggressive forms of experimental music. If you want to call Injury Reserve self-titled that, I definitely prefer that. That's my favorite from them. I also, you know, really like the experimental angle of like Death Grips and Street Sects and stuff like that. So this sort of more low-key experimental vibe just doesn't grab me as much. You know, again, it's still a good project, but, you know, maybe I just can't move on from the sort of Injury Reserve sound, and maybe I shouldn't be holding, you know, By Storm to the sound from a group that essentially doesn't exist anymore. And again, I still like it overall. It's still a pretty good project, but it's just not really the direction that Richie and Parker went in is just not the same as what I would prefer, I suppose. Alright, next up, I have listened to the Madison Beer album, Locket. It's not bad per se, but I definitely think it's her most unfocused album so far. The darker dance cuts on this one, like Yes Baby and Make You Mine, are absolutely where she shines on this project, and I honestly kind of wish she would do a full album of songs like this. Her vocals really fit that sort of echoing, moody dance vibe most of all, and, you know, that's why I still think her first album, her debut album, Life Support, is her best, even to this day. It wasn't perfect, but I think the darker and more dramatic angle to that one definitely fits her vibe and her voice more than this sort of Ariana Grande, Billie Eilish sort of singer-songwriter R&B stuff that she's got going on here. Like, For the Night is literally just a Billie Eilish track. Like, a lot of the songs on here kind of just feel like reheated Ariana Grande and Billie Eilish leftovers, if I'm being honest. I mean, they're good artists, which means this still is pretty decent. But I don't think Madison Beer has fully captured a sound that's all her own. Like, she's totally capable of knocking it out of the park. She definitely has the skills. But in my opinion, I think the biggest issue is that Madison has not fully established a core identity for herself yet, and we're 3 albums in. I think her debut album was the closest she's gotten, but it's one of those things where, like, I feel like just Madison is not playing to her strengths. The ballad-heavy second half of this record, especially, is, like, just very underwhelming compared to, again, the dance cuts on this record and a lot of her earlier work too. The songs on this thing overall are just pretty enjoyable pop tunes, but that's kind of all they are, unfortunately. And when we've had that tantalizing taste of what Madison can do when she locks in and really hones in on a sound and a style that perfectly fits her, you know, this project is pretty good, but I know that she can do something really good. Next up, we got the Formats, Boycott Heaven. You know, this is an interesting case where Nate Ruiz, the frontman of this project, seemingly has a lot to prove and yet nothing to prove at the same time. You know, it's been about 10 years since his last solo album. It's been about 15 years since the last Fun album, and about 20 years since the last album from the Format alongside his co-musician Sam Means. It's a comeback in every sense of the word, you know? It almost feels like he has to live up to the past, but when he has created hits that basically defined the 2010s, like, does he need to? Like, at this point, does he really need anything more than just like a victory lap? Either way, while some groups and artists feel like they just couldn't really follow up to what they were doing previously when they come back from a long hiatus, this album, Boycott Heaven, honestly kind of just feels like Nate never really went away. It's so charmingly early 2010s, pulling from artists like Green Day and Weezer, even some artists like, Freddie Mercury as well. I also appreciate how guitar-driven this album is compared to a lot of Nate's other work. Like, Sam really knocks it out of the park with those riffs. I also just forgot how much I really missed a Nate Ruess hook, and with songs like Shot in the Dark, Depressed, No You Don't, and Human Nature, like, it's just such a nice feeling to experience Nate's sort of musical style again. These bangers just kind of remind me why Nate and his other projects with Fun and his solo album and all of that were just such a prominent force back then. It is a bit slow to start and end, it definitely has that sort of bell curve feeling to it. It takes a bit for the album to ramp up and it kind of peters out at the end, but that middle portion is just excellent. Overall, I think this album was pretty great. Next on the list is Poppy's Empty Hands. This is another Poppy album that's overall pretty pleasant, but not all that interesting, I suppose, or adventurous is maybe the right word. It's a weird case where Poppy's music overall gets more refined the further she gets into her career, but it also ends up feeling a bit sanitized and maybe a bit formulaic as well. This album, Empty Hands in particular, really does feel like the sort of B-sides to 2024's Empty Spaces in both the good and the not so good. It's hard-hitting, but in a way that's kind of generic. The performances are pretty decent, but in a way that strips away the quirkiness that permeated her first 3 records. That quirkiness is honestly what I really miss about Poppy's projects from Flux onward, although not counting Zig, because I actually really liked Zig, that sort of like dark pop industrial sound going on. I think that fits her really well. I don't need her to go back to her YouTube Poppy persona or anything like that. That was definitely a different era for her, probably honestly an era that she doesn't really want to go back to for a lot of reasons. But even her album I Disagree, that was essentially beyond her YouTube persona as well. But even that album had a lot of her quirkiness to it. Had a lot of varied song structures and melodies and sounds on that one. Interesting genre combinations as well. And I feel like that sort of freeing experimentation is really missing on a lot of her modern work. It was very refreshing to hear that. So to hear her kind of go in a safer direction is a bit unfortunate. I will say that I probably do like this album a bit more than Empty Spaces, though, especially in the more eclectic cuts on this one. That sort of like almost breakcore influence on Unravel is really cool. The pop bounciness on Time Will Tell, and even that like sort of glitchy extravagance that you hear on songs like The Wait. It is still a good project, I would say. It's a bit more memorable than Empty Spaces, I think. But it's not really what I want from Poppy overall. I'm much more used to her combining the heaviness with a sort of like weird pop sound, like on I Disagree, or even going very weird with it, like on Zig. Like, I kind of prefer that more experimental side of her. Finally, for the last album that I listened to in January, we got XG's The Core. I have been following XG since Tippy Toe, since their debut, and they have definitely come a long way since then. They have played with a lot of different sounds since then. They've grown their fame exponentially as well. However, in that time, I feel like they've fallen into the trap that a lot of idol groups are falling into right now. That trap is that they have some great singles, but some pretty underwhelming B-sides. And unfortunately, that largely continues on this project. I think XG really shines with the bright and shimmering electronic production on songs like Shooting Star, alongside the more dark and moody production on songs like Tippy Toes or the more hip-hop influences in their cyphers. While they did nail an R&B tune with Left Right, the opposite song to Shooting Star, overall, a lot of the other cuts on here and a lot of their other R&B tunes and other genre excursions just don't really wow me. Similarly, the best songs on this album are largely the dancier cuts, like in Gala, Take My Breath, and Hypnotize. This is honestly where they excel. The dance pop in Gala is very confident, the disco influences in Take My Breath are super smooth, and I'm also really loving the sort of 90s club vibes in Mesmerize too. It all comes together in a really fun way. And In fact, it actually kind of reminds me of like New Order's output from the 90s, from like Technique era. A lot of the other tracks on here, though, are pretty unmemorable, unfortunately. In a way, they're kind of cliche and almost sound like they're here more as like an obligation because this is what a lot of other idol groups do, rather than them actually having like an idea for them. I will say, though, that Up Now is a notable exception to this, as that R&B song on here I actually think has a pretty good flow and groove to it, and that one definitely feels a bit more inspired than the other ones. Orb is also just laughably bad. You know, I always thought that XG was a bit more like in tune with hip hop culture, you know, as much as you can be from Japan compared to like other idol groups and stuff like that. But this one, man, like this sort of like Nickelodeon ass rap rock tune, it's just so tone deaf and corny, and I honestly have no idea what they were thinking with this one. Like, the fact that this like got past QA is kind of crazy. And it's even funnier too, because the final track on the album, PS 118, is actually a really good closer. That sort of smooth, jazzy hip-hop beat is something that the girls are very well versed in. I think that really plays to their strengths. So the fact that they do like kind of go off in these weird directions and directions that they just are not as good at, it kind of baffles me sometimes. Overall, you know, this album is fairly good. I wouldn't say it's bad. There are some pretty great songs on here, but it's one of those things where they just fall into that classic idol trap where there's a lot of filler in between the really great songs. So that was the wrap up of the albums that I listened to in January. I guess I can talk a little bit about the album covers as well, since that's also my thing. I might as well put that degree to use, right? So with By Storm's album cover, I find it to be like okay. You know me, like I actually really like the design heavy and typography heavy album covers. This one just doesn't really do much for me. However, I will say that I think it does fit the album's sound and aesthetic pretty well. It definitely gives the impression that this is going to be a bit darker, a bit more maybe low key, trying to find like the sort of beauty in the darkness, I suppose. So while design wise it's not my favorite, I do think it actually fits the album pretty well. Now for the Madison Beer album cover for Locket, it's one of those ones where it's just like, it's fine. It's just kind of boring, you know? When I look back at like Life Support, right, that one was very evocative. That one was very striking, not only because of like her pose and like the color scheme and stuff like that, but in the like spacing and stuff as well. It felt very much like an album cover while also being like interesting to look at, if that makes sense. This album cover feels more like a promo shoot, right? Like maybe for like a magazine or even like a tour poster or something like that. It feels more promo shoot than album cover, if that makes sense. So while it's okay compositionally, I would not say it really like gets me interested in the record. Now with Boycott Heaven, I actually think this is a great album cover. I like how simplistic it is. This just a whitish background with the figure in the middle. I think it really kind of gives the presence that they wanted it to, this sort of like almost holy figure in a sense, but it's kind of like almost falling apart, if you will. I think it actually does fit a lot of the lyrics on this record, especially when we get a few songs on this one that are a bit more like topical, a little bit more political, I suppose, as well. So this album cover I think is pretty cool. And now for XG's The Core, this album cover I also think is pretty cool. You know, it might be cheating because kanji is just really cool to look at, and I just love the sort of black and white aesthetic on here. It's very simple. It is just The Core, but I think it was very effective. And I think it does kind of showcase the more like upbeat nature, more in-your-face nature of the project. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing when it comes to songs like The Orb, but overall I like it aesthetically at least. Finally, in the last segment, I thought it'd be kind of fun to talk about the other stuff that I've been listening to in January, or that I was listening to in January at least. Things that didn't come out that year, or that month rather. And overall, during that month, I was kind of just listening to my 2025 year in review playlist that, you know, streaming platforms make for you. I was listening to a lot of like TV Girl. I love Who Really Cares and French Exit. Like, I think the production on those albums are incredible. I love how I just love the flow of those projects too. Like they're fucking hilarious just because of how overtly toxic the lyrics are. Like, there's no way this dude is not playing a character. It's so funny. But like, yeah, I love those two records. The other TV Girl stuff is good too, but those two especially I would definitely recommend. And a lot of what I've been listening to in what I was listening to in January was Magdalena Bay. You know, Imaginal Disc. I was listening to that nonstop. That is a 10 out of 10 album. I think that was my favorite album of. I think it was 2024 that it came out. That was my album of the year that year. But yeah, that album is just no skips. It's incredible. And even some of their other stuff, like the Mini Mix Volume 3 with like Top Dog and stuff on it, like god damn, the production on that, the beat on that is incredible. I think a lot of Magdalena Bay's like sort of side EPs and stuff are very underlooked in their discography, so I would definitely recommend checking those out too. Even if you have heard Magdalena Bay, maybe you haven't heard those ones, but I'm very excited for whenever they drop their new project too, because those singles are pretty damn good, I will say. But overall, yeah, that was this month. That was January 2026. This is a new segment, so definitely let me know how you like it, and if you like this sort of format, maybe it's a bit more snappy. You can kind of, I'm gonna be putting some timestamps in the description, and hopefully it segments it in the time bar on YouTube as well, so you can kind of like skip to the albums that you're interested in. Hopefully it makes it a bit more snappy, so you can actually like choose what you want to listen to, whether you want to skip the album cover reviews or just want to get to what I was listening to otherwise that month. You can do that. So let me know what you think about this new format. This is kind of what I'm going to be doing going forward. I'm going to be doing a monthly video, and then also I'm going to be kind of doing, I want to do some like starter pack stuff, like what I used to do on my TikTok, where I kind of pick a genre or pick a vibe and I give you a few albums and to check out and maybe get yourself interested in that genre or that vibe or whatever, you know. But that's going to be it for today. And I guess until the next one, farewell.